Welcome to a new episode of Film Seizure at the Movies. I'm Geoff Arbuckle, co-host of the Film Seizure podcast that you can catch each Wednesday morning with my cohorts Jason Oliver and Chuck Moore, and my solo show Monster Mondays each Monday afternoon. You can catch both of these shows at filmseizure.com. This week I have a pair of very high quality superhero movies to talk about. A little bit later I'll talk about Shin Kamen Rider from Japan and Hideki Anno. But we're going to start things off with Sony and Marvel's Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, the long-awaited sequel to the Best Animated Feature Oscar-winning Into the Spider-Verse from 2018. Into the Spider-Verse brought three really key things to the screen. The first was the quite popular, somewhat recent creation from the early 2010s, Miles Morales, the Spider-Man of Earth 1610. Miles Morales was an instant hit in the waning days of the Ultimate Marvel Comics universe, which was a 21st century creation itself that was meant to kind of create a more grounded launching point for new readers. For the most part, the Ultimate Marvel universe consisted of Spider-Man, who launched the whole thing as Peter Parker, the Avengers, known as the Ultimates in this universe, the X-Men, and the Fantastic Four. Now, other characters made Ultimate appearances, but it was basically kind of a condensed universe that ultimately came to a close in 2015 when a big crossover event brought the survivors of that Ultimate universe into the original Marvel 616 universe. Still, a standout character was Miles Morales, who became Spider-Man after an enhanced spider bit him and gave him Spider-Man powers just before Peter Parker was killed by that universe's Green Goblin. Miles is part black and part Hispanic, specifically Puerto Rican, I believe, giving him a very similar concept to the old idea of Peter Parker being a character that readers of the 60s through the 80s could kind of recognize in themselves. Miles represented a new breed of a wider audience of people of color. Miles was part Peter Parker and part the actual teenagers interested in finding characters and heroes that looked like them in comics. The next important thing Into the Spider-Verse brought to the mass audience was the concept of a multiverse. This felt almost like a deliberate lead up and kind of a wet run of concepts explored in the Marvel Cinematic Universe that begins with Avengers Endgame, continued through Spider-Man No Way Home and Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, and with the TV series Loki. We meet all sorts of different and strange spider people in Into the Spider-Verse, and a lot of them made for spot-on comedy and fun, like with Spider-Man Noir, and with the Peter Porker, the Spectacular Spider-Ham, which was a character that was created in my youth that I always remember reading in more all ages appropriate fare. But of course, the main two spider characters that join Miles throughout a vast majority of his story is Gwen Stacy from a universe in which she was bitten by the spider, not Spider-Man or Peter Parker rather, and a Peter Parker, an older kind of more loserish Peter Parker who was kind of down on his luck that becomes Miles's mentor. Now, most importantly for the medium of film, the other key thing that was brought by this first film was the animation style, which was part computer animated, at least looked like it was sort of hand-drawn in appearance, but it also had a great deal of swagger and attitude to the look. Miles liked doing graffiti, so some of the bright and bold colors has a bit of that look to it. Additionally, because he was a comic book character, along with all the other Spider-Man characters used here, there's even an old school style to it that comes across like the comics I read as a kid that sometimes had misaligned printing, but certainly had that old style of coloring that looked almost like pointillism in the way that the printing was done on newsprint pages. It's a style that immediately set this movie apart from any other animated films. All of those things also played well to how some of the storytelling was laid out to almost look like comic book page panels. That wasn't a new thing, but this was maybe in that Into the Spider-Verse movie, maybe the pinnacle of that formatting use. Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse was as much a comic book as it was a movie, as much as it was an animated film. And it was absolutely art and absolutely very worthy of its Oscar and the praise it received. And now, after a long wait that was made longer by COVID, messing up release schedules and so forth, the next chapter of Miles Morales is ready for the world as Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse is finally here. Now, generally speaking, this is still pretty top-tier comic book and animation entertainment. If the first film was about Miles trying to come to terms with the weight that is on his shoulders with these powers that he's gained and trying to figure out how to use them effectively, this sequel is essentially Miles having all the confidence in the world at what he does, but not really fully being prepared for some of the realities in the way people think, however fair or unfair that these people are to face and their ideas are to face. And on its face, that might sound like I'm actually siding with the entire multiverse of spider guys and gals and things that are trying to tell Miles that there can only be one outcome, because that's just how it always is. If you don't do the things that the system says is the way to do things and the way things have to be done, it will be detrimental and will cause suffering that can only be blamed on the person who isn't falling into line. And I'm not taking that side. That's not true at all. What's true is that Miles is still a 15-year-old kid who wants to fit into this larger world that he's in now. So he has a kind of different idea about how things are to be, and he's challenging a system. It creates potential betrayals and dangers that our hero needs to face down, and makes for generally good morality and superhero type of storytelling. But there's a lot more to it that I was picking up in some of the lines said and some of the ways that this story generally breaks down for these characters. In one of the plot lines in the movie, we have characters trying to decide whether or not telling their parents or other people that they are indeed a masked superhero. In one scenario, it goes very badly and actually destroys a relationship. In another, it would make life so much easier if that person told their parents. In both scenarios, it comes down to the character not telling their parents because they're afraid of backlash or a change in perception or a change in the way that these parents love their children. I mean, you see what I'm getting at here, right? I mean, it's absolutely an allegory here for coming out. It's something that people who aren't the typical cis heterosexual person has to really worry about. But when someone tries to reveal something about themselves that they may have heard their parents speak less than favorably about, it places that person with that secret or different way of thinking or different lifestyle in a spot that they fear explaining themselves. And there's a lot of that going on in this movie with Miles and Gwen Stacy. And then there's another undertone to this with Miles in particular, and I think it's actually brilliantly laced throughout this movie. And you're going to have to let me kind of go on a little bit of a tangent here. Over the recent years, there's been a lot of backlash put onto the character of Miles Morales from a certain sector of a group of quote-unquote fans that make a lot of hay out of claiming that he is an illegitimate Spider-Man, or that he's a knockoff, or that he's a token. And that Peter Parker is the only Spider-Man. And despite his popularity, despite his largely well-received stories that he's been a part of since his creation, Miles Morales just is a poor imitation of that hero. And you can probably guess why this is the case. The kid isn't just a newer, younger, more vibrant character dealing with younger people issues. He's a person of color. This movie has several lines regarding Miles being where he belongs and standing firm when people say he doesn't belong. The main dramatic and action-fueled climactic scene centers around the Spider-Man of the year 2099, Miguel O'Hara, basically telling Miles he has to first sit out a potentially life-altering moment as the villainous Spot tries to tear down everything that means something to our Spider-Man that we follow, Miles Morales. And when Miles says he can't do that and that the request itself is way out of line and not what he thought Spider-Man of any universe would do, he's then labeled as an imposter and illegitimate as we learn that Miles got his powers from a spider that was meant to be sent to a different universe. His receiving his powers deprived one universe of their Spider-Man, who would have likely been some form of Peter Parker, and got his Peter Parker in his universe killed. He's blamed for the degradation of all these various spider people and potentially wiping out whole universes if he doesn't get in line and basically sit superheroing out. This moment O'Hara wants Miles to sit out is called a canon event. Now, it's an entire take on how this certain subgroup of so-called fans, and a few who are particularly loud about it online, are self-appointed overseers of what they think of as lore, continuity, and yes, canon. Because they can only think of what their concept of Spider-Man is, either Peter Parker or for some, Miguel O'Hara, if they read comics in the 90s, Miles cannot fit that neatly defined concept. He's an outlier. He's illegitimate. It leads to half-assed criticisms of character growth, legacy, and media in general, and the inevitable tweets of, quote, Peter Parker is Spider-Man, Miles Morales is Miles Morales, unquote. Across the Spider-Verse is more than indirectly tackling a stupid culture war thing that rages within the fan community that erodes interest from one side of that fence and forces the opposite side to go into a futile attempt to try to explain the grift to those who fall into the trap of those who wish to make a buck off of bad faith criticisms, and then leaves everyone else outside the fandom thinking that all of that is stupid and childish, and kind of turns a blind eye to the real insidious stuff that goes on with that sort of bad faith criticism stuff. But where this movie succeeds exceptionally well in the story and script are those two interwoven concepts of coming out, whatever that might mean to an individual, and the direct and unflinching return fire on those who think that Miles Morales is somehow a lesser character just because he's something different than Peter Parker. On the visual level, the animation is great. Each world, each different Spider-Man is given his or her own different style. Miles mostly exists in a world like the original that almost feels and looks like graffiti. Gwen's world is something of a softer, almost pastel look that her comics had. Miguel looks harder and more angular. Peter Parker is more traditional in appearance in terms of a animated character. We even see Ben Reilly, the Scarlet Spider from the 90s, and in this he looks like he's cut from a comic book in that style of those appearances when he first came about in the 90s. Animated versions of Spider-Man look like the style in which they were drawn and rendered in, and so on. It's a visual treat. It's especially a visual treat when we see the Spider Society, because as a person who has a long history of Spider-Man fandom, I was constantly scanning the screen to see what I could recognize. Oh, and even live action is used in a couple of instances too. That's really clever. There are a couple of nitpicks that I do have about Across the Spider-Verse that doesn't greatly hurt the film, as I still think this is extremely high quality. But it does set this movie just below its predecessor in overall quality and impact. First, as much as I do like the various characters that have been introduced in both Spider-Verse movies, be it the lovable loser Peter Parker, Gwen Stacy, Spider-Ham, Spider-Noir, or the characters that were brought into this movie, like the arch Miguel O'Hara, Spider-Woman, the Scarlet Spider, even the Spot, the villain in this. I do wish that Miles could get his own movie free from these other characters that at times in this movie almost seem to crowd him out of his own, what will be a trilogy. I hope to someday see Miles star in his own adventure on a solo level. Maybe it's through a TV series, maybe it's through an individual movie, whatever the case. I mean, we do have a villain here, the Spot, that goes from fun to outright treacherous. That would have been good for Miles alone, but the title does say Spider-Verse, so I guess there needs to be a bunch of spiders running about. The other small ding on this movie is that the Spider-Verse is, that Into the Spider-Verse is a lovely self-contained complete story. Miles gets his powers, he overcomes his fears about how the powers work and what he can do with them, and he goes a long way in saving the day. In the sequel, it's not a self-contained movie. It ends on a cliffhanger, so we do have to come back next year to see Beyond the Spider-Verse. And I did know this going in because the original concept of this movie was to have Across the Spider-Verse parts 1 and 2. But at 2.5 hours in length and an incoming big-time problem from the character of the Spot, the cliffhanger brings a different concept that kind of muddies the main point of concern, which our main villain is supposedly planning. I think it's really going to kind of depend on what Beyond the Spider-Verse does that pays off what happens here. And because of that, you have to almost reserve a little bit of judgment for this movie before you can really bump it into its rightful grade. But I am very happy to say that both of these small nitpicks that I do have do nothing irreparable to this movie. It's still an extremely strong Spider-Man movie and a very beautiful animated film. So I am going to give it about as high of an A- as it could get. Now, also released this week was Shin Kamen Rider, the third in what I like to call the Shin trilogy from Hideaki Anno. I call it the Shin trilogy that, it started with Shin Godzilla and followed by Shin Ultraman. Shin Godzilla I've talked about on Monster Mondays. But it's not really a trilogy. Kamen Rider was not a Toho or Tsuburaya production. It comes from the Toei company. Still, this is the third of the properties Anno grew up loving. And he goes so far as to say that Kamen Rider is his favorite of the three. And it's kind of easy to see why. Kamen Rider comes from the Japanese tradition of tokusatsu, which basically means it's live action and full of practical effects. In film, that's Godzilla. On TV, you've got things like the original Power Rangers before they came over here to the States. You have Kamen Rider, you have Ultraman. However, why I think it would be easy to see this as Anno's favorite is because the Kamen Rider is a superhero. He's a bug-themed guy who rides a motorcycle and dishes out vigilante justice. Kamen Rider just basically translates to Masked Rider, which is what the American version was called, in a sort of attempt to do a similar thing that Saban was doing with Power Rangers when he brought the Super Sentai characters over. Now, currently, Kamen Rider is in its 33rd TV series that started in September of 2022 and still running. Most of the series averaged 50-ish episodes, with the original going as far as 98 episodes. And on top of that, there were 12 TV specials, one of which had Kamen Rider fighting Ultraman, which is pretty cool. Now, I personally have no connection to Kamen Rider. Most of what I know about it, I've learned over the last few years thanks to Dan Larson and Toy Galaxy on YouTube. So I was coming into this movie with almost no knowledge of the original series or concept. But let me tell you, I had an absolute blast watching Shin Kamen Rider. This movie has absolutely zero fat. There's also something kind of beautiful put into this movie, though it's through its visuals and its underlying commentary and themes. But first, the primary plot of Shin Kamen Rider, from what I understand, basically covers much of the first 8 or so episodes of the original Kamen Rider series from 1971. It features protagonist Hongo Takeshi having escaped the eventual brainwashing after his alteration made by the terrorist organization Shocker that made him into a cyborg mix of grasshopper and human. He only barely learns what he is from Professor Midori Kawa, the man who helped him escape, before the professor is killed and tasks Hongo with keeping his daughter Ruriko safe. Now, Hongo is technically referred to as Bata Augment 01, but Ruri gives him another name, the Kamen Rider, the Masked Rider. Now, Ruri and Hongo, with the occasional assistance from 2 government agents, take on various other Augs, like Spider Aug, Wasp Aug, Scorpion Aug, and one that is the first successful splicing of 3 creatures, a human, a mantis, and a chameleon. This is all leading up to an eventual showdown with a butterfly Aug, who is not only Ruri's brother, but is also apparently the tippy-top evolutionary meddling by Shocker. His goal is simple. He plans to harvest every human soul and send them to a hereafter that is kind of described as being a hell of sorts. Now, the thing about this movie is that there's this mystical energy that all things possess called prana. Now, this is actually something from Indian folklore and martial arts. Think of it as something in between a soul and the force from Star Wars. Through prana, some can harvest it to have these various powers that the various Augs possess. And some Augs can also manipulate the prana in living things to control them. It's this manipulation of the prana in humans that basically was what Shocker was originally setting out to do. They viewed humanity as something that was always in perpetual despair. Therefore, they wanted to explore and find a way to increase happiness and give humans more of a blissful existence. That, of course, could also be taken advantage of by Shocker. And at one point, Kamen Rider and Ruri take on a man whose genes are spliced with that of a bat. This Batman, if you will, designed a virus from the concept that epidemics are constantly killing people and death makes humans despair. So if he creates one final virus that he could control, then those who live would be forever grateful and happy that they or their loved ones didn't die. It's a wild, wild concept. The Wasp Aug uses a hive mind-like concept to test out simply controlling people's minds to make sure that they only live for a specific goal. Therefore, they would be happy workers or drones who would never have to feel despair of choice and so forth. Now, these are all very interesting concepts. That's, really what is at the heart of Shin Kamen Rider. Anno both muses about the importance of happiness and despair as equals, even commenting on the Japanese kanji characters of happiness and despair being so similar. It's like one can't exist without the other. So there's this whole idea of cherishing one while the other making you stronger and informs your character and so forth. Shocker is trying to remove one, which will have a massively negative effect on humanity as a whole. The key characters of this movie all have lost something. Their despair drives each of them in different ways. They ultimately have to find happiness by the end of their stories. Some of the most beautiful elements of the visuals and the emotional beats of this movie come when great despair is experienced and how it leads to something happy. There's a moment in which a character dies and leaves their will to be viewed, and it's just this character talking into a computer's webcam. And it's the first time you see that character actually displaying humanity and showing smiles and evidence that they are happy with the way things have gone. Meanwhile, the character viewing this is standing on this small cliff overlooking a skyline with a setting sun. And that character is experiencing sadness while the other one is expressing something of happiness. And it's a gorgeous shot. and a beautiful character moment all wrapped into one very emotional scene. Another beautiful emotional moment features both high action in the form of a sword fight between two Augs and an onlooker who hoped one would surrender peacefully as she was her only friend growing up. Kamen Rider has to make a choice that means something that is, kind of brutally taken away from our heroes just moments later. The aftermath of this creates this turn for the characters at the heart of the scene, and it strikes a lot of the exact right strings it needed to in order for this to be impactful and set up the second half of the film and how the stories must ultimately conclude for both Hongo and Ruri. The flip side of all this emotional stuff is the gratuitous action. This movie is smart to lean heavily into its tokusatsu roots. The action scenes are verbose, and the movements and the kicks and the punches and the poses are all extremely deliberate. You almost feel like a kid watching some of the action, because in any other setup or movie, it would kind of come off as corny. But here, you smile and kind of go with it. It uses some editing techniques and slightly animated moments to make the movements of the characters seem that much more odd and strange, like the characters that inhabit this movie are. You aren't really seeing human movements all the time because these characters are not human in the way that we think of, pure humanity. They're augmented and therefore create this whole other perception of how they move, at which speed, or how they might fight. Now, speaking of the more hand-to-hand fighting, this movie is gloriously gory. In the early scenes when Hongo is trying to adapt to his new cybernetic strength, he massacres the Spider Aug's goons by essentially crushing their heads with a single punch. It's brutal, it's bloody, and it's so over the top that you laugh and giggle and kind of love every moment of it. What's more, it makes a ton of sense, too. This guy has new powers. Of course, he's got to deal with how easy it is to turn a normal guy's head inside out with a jab or an uppercut. He's also got to deal with what his face looks like under the mask when he doesn't expel his super juice from his body. In a way, this has a tad bit more of a horror element to go along with the over-the-top superhero business. And, one of the things that is constant throughout a good chunk of this movie is Hongo having to understand where his humanity begins and ends versus when he has to use his new cybernetic strength, and dealing with the consequences on his soul, on his conscience, when he ultimately kills somebody. It means a lot to this character, and it's all builds that interesting character development. And as I said, there is zero fat on this movie. It's edited with a breakneck pace, and every scene is either action, setting up action, or emotionally charged to inform characters. It's brilliantly made, and another home run for Hideki Anno. This is going to be a contender for my top 10 of the year, and it's coming in strong with a solid grade of an A. And Shin Kamen Rider is currently making the rounds with Fathom Events, with one more showing on June 5th. But beyond that, keep an eye out for festival showings or streaming opportunities in the future. So how's that for a superhero double feature? Not a bad week at the movies at all. So don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, so you can be made aware of new episodes of our various shows as they drop. You can also follow us at podcast providers like SoundCloud, Google Podcast, Apple Podcasts, TuneIn, Stitcher, Spotify, and Audible. And you can also listen to the show on YouTube by subscribing there. I'll be back in 2 weeks with reviews of 2 more geeky movies right up my alley, with Transformers Rise of the Beasts and The Flash. So until then, don't forget to save me the aisle seat.